Um, it seems to me that the central issue on the table here is the Kononovich brothers in the context of the general repression in Ukraine. And we've been struggling here in the United States and in my city, Richmond, Virginia, on how to reach the general public with the reality, the truth of what is actually going on in Ukraine. And it's difficult because I've been doing anti-war work since 1967, and I've never seen a situation in which the media has so completely closed ranks around the official government narrative, so that there's not even a hint of skepticism. The war is supposedly between two countries in Europe, and yet the news media acts as if they are cheerleaders for one side. And the coverage is so completely seamless that, as one of the other speakers brought up before, if you try to raise an alternative narrative, you're looked upon like you're crazy. So I think there's two ways to approach this. One is to point out the cost to working people in our own countries of this war. And the other is to talk about the reality of the situation, particularly in terms of the history of the conflict and the history of Ukraine. The first one is easier because people are always interested in their pocketbook issues. And as John Parker mentioned, the United States has just announced that it's going to send, I believe the exact figure is $2.98 billion in military aid, which comes on top of $10.6 billion in military aid. Plus, as of June, I believe the figure for non-military aid since the Russian intervention in Ukraine was 5.6 billion. So we're talking real money here at a time when people are facing inflation and the shrinking of the value of their wages and fears of a recession. So the idea that we're sending, more than, let's add that up, $21 billion to Ukraine in a war that people don't really understand. They've been primed to be sympathetic to the Ukrainian side. There's just a tsunami of heartrending humanitarian stories, the type that you never see when it comes to the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, which is in Yemen, or the threat of starvation of 6 million people in Ethiopia, or the developing crisis because of global warming in sub-Saharan Africa. You never hear those types of sympathetic stories like you do in terms of Ukraine. But there are some ways to approach it. And I think finding ways to go over the history of it is important. In Richmond, we have an organization, the Virginia Defenders for Freedom, Justice, and Equality. We're just celebrating our 20th anniversary. It's an all-volunteer, multi-issue, predominantly African-American, predominantly woman organization. And we have different focuses of work. We do a lot of work with prisoners, community struggles, and we're best known for a 20-year struggle to reclaim and properly memorialize the section of downtown Richmond that was, before the Civil War, the center of the U.S. domestic slave trade, which has been virtually ignored in the 150 years since. That area called Shockoe Bottom is going to be, within a few years, a 10-block memorial park. So that history of struggle on domestic issues that have won respect and trust from the public, particularly the working class and the communities of color, has put us in a good position to raise more difficult issues. From 2007 to 2011, we did a lot of work around Iran. We traveled to Iran, we wrote about it, we wrote a book, we did a lot of public speaking, and we were able to fend off accusations that we were just working in the employ of the Iranian government or something like that, because we had local credibility. I'm not raising that just to pat ourselves on the back, but because I think that in the United States, at least, the anti-war movement has become increasingly divorced from domestic struggles. And that is why it's difficult to approach people who have a lot on their plate already and try to talk to them about an international issue. We wrote a story we have a quarterly newspaper with a press run of 15,000. And it's distributed in 14 cities and counties around the state. Before February 24th, we wrote a story about the background to what was then a developing conflict. After the war broke out, we took a formal statement, position statement on the war, which basically pointed out the steady eastward expansion of NATO and the U.S. support for the 2014 coup and the now 8-year war in the Donbass, all of which form the background to the present conflict, and all of which, of course, is ignored. Whenever the Ukraine is mentioned, the history seems to begin with what is described as the Russian takeover, annexation, invasion of Crimea, with no discussion whatsoever about the 2014 coup. In 2016, a couple of us represented the United National Anti-War Coalition in a social forum conference in Wrocław, Poland. And we had the opportunity to meet with members of the Council of Mothers of May 2. And they showed us video of the Odessa massacre of May 2, 2014, and said that they were recruiting people to come to Odessa as international observers for the second memorial of that massacre, which was being threatened by the neo-fascist organizations. One of them had applied for a permit to hold a workshop on firing machine guns at the site of the memorial at the time and hour of the memorial. A couple of us did go. Bruce Gagnon from the Global Network for Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space, and Regis Tremblay, an independent videographer, and myself. And we did go, and some 3,000 to 4,000 Odessans turned out for that memorial, completely overwhelming the numbers of neo-fascists who turned out. And that was the genesis of the Odessa Solidarity Campaign, which we've continued each year. The primary work is to promote local actions around the world on May 2nd to commemorate the Odessa massacre, particularly as a way of exposing the fact that there is a strong and growing and expanding fascist movement in Ukraine, which works hand in glove in the government and has been incorporated into the military. And when there's talk of denazification of Ukraine, there's absolutely a reason for pointing that out, because there is I would describe the Ukrainian government as fascist tolerant rather than actually fascist itself, but there are fascists in the government, and the fascist paramilitary organizations play a leading role in the military, which is why you can't believe anything that they say about anything that's happening in the war. We were able to have a protest at NATO command in Norfolk. There's Brussels and there's Norfolk as the two NATO commands. And there's local anti-war activists in the Norfolk area in Virginia have been holding protests there. We were able to join with them and have a larger regional action. And the articles in our newspaper, the latest one, well, we did produce one story on political repression in Ukraine, which talks about as has been mentioned, the fact that 11 political parties, I guess now it's 15, have been banned since February 24th. That all television stations have been consolidated into one state run television station to produce one seamless narrative of the conflict. Our understanding is that as of about 6 weeks ago, there were some 15,000 people who had been arrested in Ukraine for dissenting from the government line on the war, often just social media comments. I do want to mention the case of Yuri Tkachev, who is the editor of the online publication Timer, Timer, based in Odessa. This is a mainstream municipal news agency that reports on things like city budgets and car accidents and sewage problems, but gave a very factual coverage of the Odessa massacre in 2014. And shortly after the outbreak of the conflict, the present conflict, Yuri was arrested at his apartment and framed up on the terrorism charges. Which anyone who knows him is completely ridiculous. And I did have the opportunity to meet Yuri in Odessa at the second anniversary massacre. And he's someone who would not be considered a radical, a leftist. He's just an honest journalist. And yet he was arrested. And there's so many others in his situation. Here in the United States, we're in a different situation, I believe, than in the UK or some other European countries, where the left, the socialist left in general, and the anti-war movement in particular, have been going through a very sad atrophy over the last number of years. Part of it was a result of the 8 years of the Obama administration, in which many progressives wanted to defend Obama from racist attacks, which was completely appropriate, but it also meant giving him a blank check on international issues. So, for example, there was very little outcry when NATO and the US bombed Libya into a failed state. And also, it was during the Obama administration that the US supported the 2014 coup in Kiev. Another element is that's particular to the United States is the rise in nonprofit organizations. Some laws were changed that made it easier. And now young activists, instead of forming volunteer collectives or joining left organizations, their goal is to go to work for a nonprofit and, as they say, do well by doing good. In other words, get paid for the work that you do. And the problem is that these nonprofits are inevitably funded by foundations friendly to the Democratic Party, which don't want them to raise anything having to do with foreign policy, and they don't. So that's another reason for the shrinking of the left. A third problem we're facing is that the Justice Department has just opened up an offensive against activists who are questioning the US official line on Ukraine. There was a memo that was released by the Justice Department claiming that a Russian citizen who founded the organization anti-globalization movement is a paid operative of the Russian government and was recruiting organizations in the United States to push a pro-Russia line in their communities. And one of the organizations that they mentioned and that they have targeted is the African People's Socialist Party, a left revolutionary Black organization that's been around for 40 years and has always taken an anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist stance. And just a few weeks ago, the FBI came to the home of the chairman of the organization, Omowale Yeshitela, and broke down the door, sent in a drone with flashbang grenades at 5 o'clock in the morning, handcuffed the chairman and his wife, and brought them out of the house while they ransacked the house and took all their communications equipment. And they're apparently preparing to accuse them of being unregistered agents of a foreign government. They also mentioned 3 other cities where organizations supposedly were working for the cooperating with the Russian government. This is bound to have a chilling effect. Of course, our organization in Richmond is one of the groups that has been promoting a narrative that is very contradictory to the U.S. government's. There should be a much broader anti-repression response than there has been in the United States to this FBI attack. But it's difficult. However, it's not impossible. We were able to get an opinion piece in the Sunday edition of the Richmond Times-Dispatch, which is the leading political, daily newspaper in the state of Virginia. And the article was called "The Provocations Behind the Unprovoked War," which talked about the steady expansion of NATO to the borders of Russia and the U.S. support for the 2014 coup. We'll be doing an article in the next issue about an update on the political repression, including on the Kononovich brothers and on the African People's Socialist Party. And I think, forgive me if it seems like I'm talking too much about our own organization, but I believe we have found a formula for raising these difficult issues to working people, despite the fact that we've had 3 major articles on Ukraine in our newspaper and the op-ed in the Times-Dispatch. We face very little pushback from the public in general, let alone from our own base in the working class communities and communities of color. We're not doing nearly enough. It's a real honor to be included in this program today. And we commit ourselves to working with all of you in a broader campaign to focus attention on the Kononovich brothers and on others who have been, repressed in the present period, and to try to tear the veil away from the reality of what is happening in Ukraine and the fact that it's not a democratic state, that it relies on neo-Nazi organizations for its operation and its military functioning, and will be in the trenches with you. And thank you again so much for inviting us today.
Thanks very